He's come at last. He stands at the precipice after fighting battles, wars, and conquests, and murder and enslavement aplenty. Caesar has finally come to the British by crossing the English Channel. Salvete, and welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 2, Alea, Iacta est. In the late summer of 55 BCE, Julius Caesar stood on the northern shores of Gaul, watching the restless waters of the Channel. Beyond the shifting waves rose the pale chalk cliffs of Britain. Obviously, even as today, you could see them, gleaming like a frontier to another world. To the Roman imagination, this island was both legendary and elusive, a place spoken of by Greek geographers, said to be rich in metals and trade but shrouded in mystery. Almost no Roman had seen it, let alone marched upon its soil. Yet Caesar, already famous for his victories in Gaul, had decided to risk crossing. His decision to invade would mark the first step in Rome's centuries-long entanglement with Britain. As he would be quoted to have said when he crossed the Rubicon to go to war against Ptolemy, Alea Iacta est, or the die is cast. Caesar made a decision that will be the first step in creating Britain in its Roman version. The long tide of general migration and invasion had arrived once again to Britain's shores, only this time from a highly organized and experienced military arrived with it. Of course, in this episode, we'll explore why Caesar made that choice, what his invasion actually looked like, and what the political and cultural landscapes of both Gaul and Britain looked like on the eve of Rome's arrival. So, why did he invade? I think we brushed a little bit by this on the last episode, but on the surface, Caesar claims that he had a practical reason. The Britons, he wrote in his Gallic Wars, had provided aid and reinforcements to their cousins in Gaul, supplying warriors and supplies to tribes resisting Rome. Unacceptable, of course. By crossing into Britain, he intended to sever that support. Yet, of course, many scholars suggest that this was only just a convenient justification of a larger ambition. The deeper motivation was a personal one. Caesar's position in Roman politics was precarious. His alliances with Pompey and Crassus demanded constant proof of his ability to deliver glory and resources to the other members of the triumvirate. Conquering Gaul had already boosted his standing, giving him the ability to finally finance his own career. He had been very reliant on Crassus up to this point for his positions, but also for the money he needed to run for elections and to meet people in court and be able to defeat legal prosecution. You're not going to do that if you don't have the finances gained from a big victory. It also helps that you can go back with all of your booty, show it off, and make a big deal out of it, and the people just love you because of it. And of course, Britain promised something more spectacular. No Roman general had ever crossed the Channel with an army. To plant Rome's eagles in Britain would be to outdo all of his rivals, both in novelty and in daring. The Romans, of course, were fascinated by the edge of what they considered to be the known world. To them, Britain was much an idea as a place, a distant island, triangular in shape in the early descriptions, perched on the edge of the ocean, inhabited by painted warriors and druids. And druids, of course, got a bad name for Caesar. Conquest there would echo in the Senate halls back in Rome, and being able to do that is a legendary achievement. Caesar's biographer, Suetonius, even noted that Caesar hoped to exploit Britain's mineral wealth, especially the tin from Cornwall and lead from Somerset, which of course were commodities that had long entered European trade routes. Historians such as Barry Cunliffe argue that the invasion was part of a military reconnaissance, part political theater. By launching even a limited expedition, Caesar could demonstrate his control over Gaul and project Roman power across the sea. He was as much staging a performance of dominance as waging any real conquest. Of course, as we mentioned last time, by mid 50 BCE, Julius Caesar's fortunes were tied to Roman politics as much as it was to the battlefields of Gaul. He was one of the three most powerful men in Rome, part of this so-called First Triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. Now, to be clear, the reason why we say so-called is because triumvirate doesn't really enter as a name until the later one with Mark Antony and I want to call him Augustus, but it's Octavian and Lepidus. But this one is a much more powerful and actually a much more balanced one. Yet this alliance is still uneasy. It was built on mutual advantage rather than friendship. None of them loved one another. Closest could be Crassus and Julius Caesar, but yet they needed Pompey. Pompey had power. Pompey had status. Pompey was a successful military leader. All those things that Crassus, for example, wasn't. Crassus was the money man. Largely, he was a terrible military man, as for the most part, although he's well known for stomping out Spartacus. Yet his alliance was also built on other linkages. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter Julia, but political alliance in Rome shifted quickly, and of course, at the death of Julia, it would create what would eventually become the war between Caesar and Pompey. And of course, all of these rivals watched each other for any sign of weakness. Worse yet, for Caesar, at this point he was the junior partner, as I mentioned earlier, supported financially by Crassus and paled in exposure and success than Pompey. He needed to plump his reputation. He needed it to happen through conquest and spoil, because at the blunt end of a sword, he could gain everything he needed that he couldn't get. In the meantime, upsetting the Senate. Caesar knew that returning to Rome too soon was dangerous. His enemies in the Senate were eager to prosecute him for abuses of power, going beyond what his mandate was. He kept stretching the idea of his war against the Gauls from being a little area in Gaul to getting further and further north until he conquested the whole area. And of course, without his army at his back, which he would have to leave before he entered Rome, his position would collapse and his power would probably with it. Remaining in Gaul gave him both protection and the prestige he was looking for. Every victory abroad translated into influence at home, ensuring that his political enemies could not move against him without appearing unpatriotic. And Lord knows, nobody wants to be unpatriotic. The invasion of Britain must be understood in this context. They were not simply expeditions across the Channel, but part of Caesar's broader strategy to delay his own return to Rome while gathering new honors and keeping himself in the spotlight. And by extending his campaigns, he avoided the courtrooms and instead offered the Roman people the spectacle of daring exploits at the very edge of the known world. Meanwhile, Gaul itself, of course, remained unstable. Though Caesar had inflicted defeats on the tribes, such as the Neverii and the Venti, resistance flared constantly. The tribes of northern Gaul, in particular, maintained close links to the Britons, and in exchange of goods, coinage, and of course, as we mentioned in the last episode, warriors, helped them to continue the struggle. Archaeological finds in Gallo-Belgic coins in Kent probably confirm these deep connections across the Channel, and as we mentioned in the last episode, Caesar saw this as reason to invade. Quote from Caesar himself, he resolved to proceed into Britain. Keep in mind, whenever you're reading Caesar's writings about himself, he always refers to himself in the third person like he is writing a book, a biography, rather than an autobiography, I guess is how I would describe it. Go back to the quote. because in almost all of Gallic's wars, succor has been furnished to our enemies from Britain." End quote. Yet beyond this justification lay Caesar's real concern. As I said, demonstrating his military reach by intimidating the Gallic tribes who were looking for Britain's allies' help. It helped to impress the audiences in Rome. It did all of these things. It was a multifaceted demonstration. As historian Barry Cunliffe argued, the Channel expeditions were as much about performance as about conquest, a stage on which Caesar could show himself as the general who dared what no Roman had yet attempted. And of course, as mentioned in the last episode a little bit, what was the society that awaited Caesar in Britain? Far from primitive and isolated. In fact, one could argue far from his own descriptions of it. There was a actual culture there. There was an actual settlements that were forming. There were areas that we would be considering as villages that were forming. There was fortifications. There was all sorts of things going on that showed that Britain was a healthy area, driven by its own ideals and own understandings of things in this period. Obviously, tribal or local kingships existed. There wasn't unity by the way we would measure it, and largely it was broken across many barriers and many things that divided all of these people. Likely they fought wars amongst each other just like everybody else. They likely hated, murdered, raped, pillaged each other just as much as what'll happen later. But we don't know enough to say for sure on all of it. But we do know that Iron Age Britain was definitely not well known for its peace and stability. In the southeast, in Kent, Sussex, and the Thames Valley, was particularly prosperous thanks to its proximity to Gaul and its ability to trade with them. Chieftains, of course, again, as we mentioned in the last episode, imported goods like wine. They got bronze vessels and jewelry, which signaled their wealth and prestige. Britain's political structure, however, was fragmented. Each tribe was led by a chieftain, possibly a king. Rivalries between them could be intense. Archaeologists such as Miranda Aldhouse Green describes Iron Age Britain as a land of shifting alliances where leadership was based not only on hereditary claims, but on military success and the ability to attract followers. Very similar, really, to the way the Welsh kingdoms formed in the early medieval period in this, and probably, let's be honest, all of Britain's various tribal kingdoms that came out of the end of the Roman settlements. And of course, archaeological finds reinforce this picture. In Herefordshire and Essex, there were rich burials containing chariots, weapons, and ornate goods, showing the importance of warrior elites. Hill forts, of course, like Maiden Castle and Danbury, showed the need and the use of fortresses to act as both symbols of authority and hubs for trade. This political fragmentation meant Caesar could hope to divide and rule. Some tribes might resist fiercely, but others might see opportunity in aligning with Rome against their neighbors. Very similar to, if you think about it, to the Spanish conquest of Latin America, in the fact that they did that. They used, like within the case of the Aztecs, they used their neighbors' hatred of the Aztecs to help them win against said Aztecs. This is not an uncommon strategy, and it kind of works. Of course, this lack of unity made Britain vulnerable to Caesar's calculated gamble. Caesar's fleet, of course, would reach the chalk cliffs, almost certainly what we consider to be the White Cliffs near Dover, where Britons mustered on their heights. Seeing no safe way to land under missile fire, probably slings and arrows and spears, he shifted 7 miles along the coast to a flat, open beach, usually placed somewhere near Walmer or Deal in East Kent. There, around midday, he ordered the beach warships to support the landing with missiles, while heavily burdened legionaries waited ashore. And it was in the midst of this surf and the entrance of all these various warriors that we have what is called the beach fight. This fight in the surf was chaotic. Men in armor leapt into shoulder-deep water, while British chariots and horses pressed the shallows. Once the Romans formed up on firm ground, they drove the Britons back and established a camp. Crucially, Caesar's cavalry, stuck at sea by the contrary winds, never joined him, limiting the pursuit and intelligence they could gather, which of course would be a problem. That night brought the ocean's lessons. The spring tide that accompanies the full moon surged higher than the Romans, Mediterranean sailors, expected. Anchors parted, several ships broke, others lost rigging and became unseaworthy. Repair work consumed precious days and shook morale in the camp, already short of horses and scouts, was effectively crippled. Before the landing, Caesar had sent Commanus, his ally of the Atrebates, to go out and win allies in Britain. Instead, the Britons seized him on arrival. After the beach battle, they returned Commius and sued for peace, offering hostages, a pattern suggesting divided councils amongst coastal politics. I would also say that it's probably something they had done amongst themselves and saw it as a way to settle arguments and fights. But of course, Caesar's not well known for just taking yes as an answer. Now, the Britons fought with light chariots, which harassed at speed, and then they would dismount for a fight on foot, while skilled drivers hovered in rapid extraction areas. Effectively, they would launch an assault, then drop off, fight as much as they could, and the minute things were going badly, these chariots could get them the heck out. This, of course, led to Caesar's famous description. Quote, "Their mode of fighting with chariots is this. First, they drive about in all directions and throw their weapons." End quote. Archaeology independently showed that these chariots were a part of the British elite material culture and martial culture for centuries. Iron Age chariot burials in East Yorkshire preserved vehicles, horse gear, and warrior grave goods, material proof that dovetails with Caesar's own account. As the Romans tried to maintain their repairs on the boats, they sent out foraging parties to try and get food, likely elements of the 7th Legion, but as they were reaping corn, they were surprised. Britons poured out with chariots and cavalry. The Romans rallied, counterattacked, and held the field, but the incident exposed the risk of operating inland without cavalry screening. With ships patched and the season closing, in other words, the dangers of crossing the English Channel become elevated, and it was starting to get closer to winter, Caesar accepted that renewed submissions and hostages would have to be gathered, and they would need to embark. The expedition had been a dramatic reconnaissance rather than a conquest. Rome had learned Britain's coasts and tides and tactics, and Caesar had the headlines he wanted in Rome. He would return, of course, better prepared the following year. Now, it is important to understand that the first invasion left little archaeological trace, but the coastlines of East Kent matched Caesar's description of the cliffs near Dover and the open landing beach further north. For the second invasion a year later, Caesar established a fortified base at Pegwell Bay on Thanet, where excavations have revealed the Roman defenses and sling bullets. This provides insight into how his army might have operated even in 55 BCE. Cross-channel trade, of course, also explained the invasion. Coins from Gaul circulated in Kent long before Caesar arrived. Proof of established links between the various areas, and their ties may have been, as we said, the very reason that Caesar believed that British tribes were either Gallic in nature or at least supported the Gallic resistance. Although it was militarily inconclusive, the expedition gave Caesar vital intelligence: the tides and strength of the British chariots, the difficulty in landing under fire, and he won, importantly, political capital in Rome, claiming that Britain submitted to his authority. Most importantly, it prepared the way for his larger, more organized second invasion the following year. 1 year after his brief landing on the Kentish shores, as mentioned, Julius Caesar returned to Britain in 54 BCE. This time he was prepared and had a much larger force, determined not merely to scout but to impose Roman power more decisively. This was the expedition where Caesar learned from past mistakes, adapted his logistics, and came closest to conquering the southern part of Britain, at least for a season anyway. Now, Caesar's motives have not entirely changed. Britain was still aiding rebellious Gauls in his mindset, and especially by providing warriors and refuge. Yet prestige, as always, is the driving factor. A successful invasion would bolster his political position in Rome at a time when his group was beginning to fracture. This time, Caesar assembled more than 800 vessels of varying sizes, transport, supply ships, and war galleys, carrying 5 legions and about 2,000 cavalry. Crucially, he designed broader, lower-built transports, easier to beach and to load with horses. Learning from the tide disasters of 55 BCE, he was more prepared this time for the ocean's rhythms. This time, the fleet crossed the Channel and made landfall at what archaeologists now identify as Pegwell Bay in Kent. Excavations at Ebbets Fleet revealed traces of large defensive dishes and sling bullets, matching Caesar's account of the construction of the fortified beachhead. Unlike the previous year, the Britons showed little resistance to the initial landing. Instead, they pulled back inland, hoping to fight on their own terms rather than on the Romans. Caesar, of course, was never going to do that. He marched his legions from the coast and devastated villages as he went. Easy to do when you have dirt and roundhouses and wood. All makes it very easy to burn. He would then go with a scorched earth strategy that was intended both to supply his army and break tribal resistance. His cavalry ranged widely, pressing the Britons into a retreat. But Britain tribal leaders were not idle. Cassivellaunus, chieftain of the Catilavani, rose to lead his defense. Caesar, of course, portrayed this leader as a skilled war leader who relied on guerrilla tactics. His warriors harassed Roman foragers, attacked supply lines, and used the mobility of the chariots to strike unexpectedly quickly and would leave just as fast. The Roman heavy infantry was formidable in pitched battles, but in wooded, marshy interior of Britain, the British forces were able to keep them off balance. Archaeology lends weight to Caesar's description of this. Sites across southeast Britain show hill forts, trackways, oppida belonging to powerful political people, like these leaders of various tribes like the Trinovantes and the Catilaveni. Chariot burials in Yorkshire and elite warrior graves with horse gear remind us that mobile warfare was deeply embedded into Britain's martial culture. Eventually, one of the most dramatic moments of the campaign comes at the Thames River. Caesar, describing how the Britons had fortified a crossing point with stakes driven into the riverbed, which of course would be a problem. Despite this, Roman legionaries forced their way across in tight formation, with their shields interlocked and pushing into water under missile fire. The Britons would, of course, fall back. Caesar's fortunes improved when the Trinovantes, the rival tribe of the Cassivellaunus, defected to him. Their leader, Mendebraccius, had been driven into exile by the other tribe, but had returned under Caesar's protection. The Trinovantes provided grain and intelligence, and suddenly Caesar not only had the army, he also had the allies who knew the territory and could describe and give him the advantage he so desperately needed. This meant that further resistance was now becoming futile, and so the local tribes sued for peace. And Castellvellaunus agreed to pay tribute and promised not to wage war against the Trinovantes. Basically a revenge tour, if you want to call it that. This, despite the victory, did not mean that Caesar was now maintaining a claim and taking over this area of Britain that he had conquered. He couldn't remain. His legions were strained by shortages of grain, and with an unresting Gaul requiring his presence, Caesar knew it was time to go. After imposing terms, taking hostages, and proclaiming Roman supremacy, Caesar withdrew to the continent. The Roman presence in Britain had ended, and with him, it would be nearly a century before Emperor Claudius attempted permanent conquest in 43 CE. As we mentioned, modern excavations at Pegwell Bay strongly support Caesar's narrative at the landing zone, as all of the ditches and the various weapons were datable to the mid-1st century BCE. The Thames crossing, of course, remains debated, but archaeological evidence of fortified riverbanks and trackways fit Caesar's description of prepared defenses. Coinage also reveals shifting alliances. Gaulish, Belgic coins and early British tribal issued coins mark their wealth and connections to leaders like these of Castellvellaunus and Mandebracus, but it also shows that these leaders probably existed at least in some matter, again, giving an understanding and ability to know that Caesar was telling at least some of the truth. Although Caesar never established a more permanent Roman foothold, the expedition demonstrated the reaction to Roman arms and exposed tribal rivalries in southern Britain. It showed how Rome could leverage diplomacy and force together setting patterns of later imperial conquest. For Caesar, personally, the invasion served its purpose. It provided a dramatic episode for his commentaries, enhancing his prestige back at home. Keep in mind, the Gallic Wars are being written not as a book to be memorialized later after his death. They were written specifically to tell people back home what he'd done, why he's so great, why everybody should follow him, and why they should, be in awe of his abilities. It was a bragatory idea being spread to the communities. Not unlike, if you think about it, news features on TV talking about wars and, especially with the way some of it's carried out, and they use things to try and make it seem like things are happening maybe when they weren't, like they killed 40 million people when they didn't, bragging about what they were doing, talking up their own achievements and negating the losses and the terrible cost that really comes with war. It was something we saw in like World War II, for example. Of course, they're limited in scope, these invasions, but they were pure symbolism. They allowed him to portray himself as the first Roman to pierce the ocean frontier, to conquer a new land that no one had been to, end quote. Enhancing his political prestige at home, he also brought back slaves and brought back, tribal tributes. When he eventually had his great conquering entrance into Rome, he had amongst him some of these examples. They also revealed Britain as both a challenge and an opportunity, with divided tribes, valuable trade, and military glory around the corner. For Britain, of course, these expeditions were a shock. They demonstrated that even the sea could not protect them from the reach of Rome, and within a century, of course, Claudius would return with overwhelming force, beginning the long occupation that reshapes the island's history. On the eve of Caesar's arrival, Gaul was already being reshaped by Roman dominance, which Britain had stood as a vibrant but divided society against. The clash between them in 55 and 54 BCE was less a conquest than an encounter. The first collision between the world of Iron Age Britain and Imperial Rome. I would like to thank you for watching or listening today. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh history. If you're following on YouTube, a like and a subscription would be great. Helps the podcast out tremendously. Comment below if you have ideas and comments that you want me to talk about, things you'd like us to bring up in this podcast. I will take them as note, as I often do, and probably feature them at some point. At least if I can find it. That's always the big caveat. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also do so at social media. Most of my social media is Welsh History Pod. And as usual, on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Thank you all for listening and viewing once again. Take care. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.